Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and another exciting show for you this evening. Just a couple of things. Next week, I'm back on the East Coast, by the way. Had a wonderful time out on the West Coast, and going to be here for next week. We have a great guest, Chris Pittman. He's been in a lot of TV shows. He's a UFO historian, a real nice guy. I'm really looking forward to that show. I'm going to be doing that show from New England. And then the following week, my friend and I are heading out to Arizona. We're going to be at the MUFON boot camp. I'm going to be filming during the boot camp. I actually have permission, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And then we're going to be doing a show right from one of the MUFON members' homes out there with, I think, Matthew Roberts, who is a guest that a lot of people really liked on the show before. He lives there. He's going to be joining us. As far as I know, that should work out. This week, we have a blog by Charles Lear. Again, hats off to him. He does a lot of really good work. This title to this one's called UFOs, NICAP, and the CIA. NICAP is the National Investigations Committee for Aerial Phenomena. That was founded back in 1956. And it was actually, it appears to be that it was founded by a CIA member, or he had something to do in the past with the CIA. And so it's a bit of a cloudy area, whether the CIA, well, they actually admitted they were overt and was putting it out there that they were part of it in the very beginning. And then later on as well, I know Jack Brewer has done a lot of investigations on this. And I'm not really sure if it can be 100% sure that there was CIA involvement all the way along, but I do believe that they wanted to find out some information. And there was also something about propulsion at one time that was very interesting, that someone involved in NICAP was involved in. Great article over there. And as always, they're made into audio blogs that come out about during the weekend every week, that also pops up on YouTube and also on our podcast feed. And by the way, if you are new and you want to join the podcast feed, the RSS link is right on our website, which is podcastufo.com. Anyone can support the show for $2 or more a month. And that link is over again on podcastufo.com. Also on the sidebar, you can join the mailing list so you can find out who's on our show every week. And also a link to the blog. You only get one newsletter a week. I don't inundate people with anything else, but just who the guest is. And if there's a sudden change that may come up. Other than that, I will leave everyone alone, and you can join. All you have to do is drop in your email address and confirm it, and that's it. So anyway, our guest this evening, Dr. Irena Scott, she was on about 4 or 5 years ago, and she has been doing a lot of work, good work in this field. She has a DIA background. She, I believe, went to veterinary school. I can talk to her a little bit more about that. She has her Ph.D. And she is a wonderful guest. I remember her from last time. Very enjoyable. And it gives me great pleasure to bring her on the show this evening. And here she is. Welcome to the show. Do you want to be called Irena, or what would you like to be called?
Irena, that's my name.
Okay. All right. Now, I remember Irena. Thanks so much for your willingness to be on. I tried to get Calvin Parker. I'm not sure. He's had some health issues. I tried to get him to join us, but I wasn't able to reach him. But that would, but he still has time. I mean, if he sends me an email or whatever during the show, I can still try to bring him in. But anyway, I remember you telling me about your background, but you, if I have this right, you grew up kind of on the poor side, and I believe you only had a radio when you were growing up, and you didn't have a TV, and you had some type of strange UFO encounter, but it was a small thing. And let's start out with that. When you were really young, this thing came into your room, and I want to rule out the obvious things that it could have been. First of all, Firefly. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. You thought it was more like an orange glowing thing. It was small, like the size of a few inches or something like that. And it was like an orange glowing thing? Did it blink at all, or was it a steady light?
Well, since the Tic Tac has come out, it was just about like that. It was small and shaped sort of like a cough drop or a Tic Tac. And
how about that? Yeah.
so I have something to describe it with now. It was, yeah, it looked like a little piece of metal. It looked like sort of like real hot iron glows. And we were very poor at the time. My parents had been farming with horses almost before that, and they electrified, and we got a radio, but we weren't exposed to the media at all. And we never heard of UFOs or flying saucers or even space travel or anything else. It happened to my sister and I, and we were sleeping in opposite sides of a attic room. And it was summer and nice weather and dark at night. And I just woke up, and this thing was flying around the room. And it was nothing like a firefly, which we were quite familiar with from living on a farm. And like nothing I'd ever seen before. But it was just sort of buzzing around, like just a browsing motion, like it was looking around or something. But I soon noticed, I was about 6 years old, and my sister was about 4, and I didn't know she was awake. But we apparently had both woke up about the same time. I noticed pretty soon that it didn't run into anything. It would just fly around. If it came to an obstacle, it would veer off. It deflected from walls and the furniture and everything else. And so I couldn't understand it because it looked like something dead, but it was behaving like something alive. And I thought this was very, very strange. And it kept flying around. It got close to both of us. And I wasn't especially scared or anything. I just didn't have any idea what it was because I'd never seen anything like it. It didn't blink. It didn't make any sound. Then it, after just sort of just a random motion like it browsing, but it came close to us a couple of times, both of us. It flew up to the ceiling, but it didn't hit the ceiling. It turned and veered off. And there was it was an attic room, and the walls came together at the top. There was about 3 feet in between them with a chandelier in the middle of the room. And it flew around under the, it flew from where it was to the chandelier, and it seemed to know where it was, and it seemed to know how to get between it and the walls. And it just began to circle the chandelier, but between the chandelier and the walls. And then it circled for quite a while. And then it came down just in a perfect spiral, just like if you put a line right straight down from the chandelier. And when it got just about directly below the chandelier, we both became terrified and started running out of the room and screaming and everything. And we were so terrified we ran into each other and fell down the stairs, and then we couldn't get the stair door open. And we ran to our parents shrieking, and they told us that nothing had happened, that we were just imagining it. And obviously we weren't, because 2 of us saw it, but they sort of kept on saying that, we were lying or imagining it. So that was what happened.
Yeah. I know. I remember I had a bat come in my room, and my father didn't believe me.
Well, I had a bat come in my room, and I got a video of it and put it on YouTube.
Well, and I remember also the other sighting you had. We talked about this too. The other sighting you had was really weird because a trucker stopped when you were trying to take a picture, and you were pointing to the object, and he kept turning and looking the opposite way of the way you were pointing. That's what I remember you told me from the last time you were on, which is the most bizarre thing. And then the thing got away, and you didn't get a picture of it, or you didn't get a good picture or something, right?
Well, yeah. It should have been obvious. My sister was there too. And we he came up and started talking to us. And at first I thought we had another witness because the thing was close and you could see in the windows, and we thought they were windows instead of panels. And we'd seen blimps with, lighted sides and things. And he came up and said, "What are you looking at?" And I pointed and acted like it was an airplane. I didn't say UFO. And he just rotated around, looked in the exact opposite direction, and said, "I don't see anything." Then he turned back around and looked at me and said, "I don't," and said, "What are you looking at?" And I pointed again at it. And he turned around. Right before that, I was just ready to get a perfect picture too. And I missed it due to him. But then he turned around just exactly the opposite of where it was. So he must have known where it was. Said, "I don't see anything." He turned back around, and then he did a motion like pointing his head or something, like I was insane. And then he went back to his truck, and I found out some more about that recently too. But he went back to his truck, but I did get a picture, and it turned out good, and I published it in a scientific journal. But then I decided to get on the freeway and turn my car around so it'd be going the opposite direction. Well, he got right behind me, right on my bumper, turned his bright lights on, showing them in my mirror so that I was just blinded because trucks have higher lights, I think, than cars do. And I slowed down and speeded up and everything else, and he just stayed on my bumper. And I thought he was going to kill us. And I finally thought, well, he's a truck, he must be heavier, and I floored it. Well, he stayed right behind me. And so I couldn't get rid of him. And finally, I decided what to do would be to go on the left-hand side of the road, and then when I saw an intersection, just suddenly veer off. And I did that and got rid of him. But he could have killed us. And so it was a pretty suspenseful event.
That's much more horrific than the UFO sighting itself. He wasn't wearing black, was he?
I don't know.
Black? No.
It was dark. And I didn't know he was going to chase us beforehand. I mean,
so bizarre.
I would have observed him more, I guess, but we were pretty busy watching the object too.
So I know your training is, are you actually a veterinarian, or did you train to be one?
Well, I wanted to get in astronomy, and I tried that.
Right. I was going to go there. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was male only for a long time. And so finally, I was working my way through school, and I didn't have a lot of money. So eventually, I went to vet school and got a Ph.D., but I didn't really want to be a vet. I wanted to do research, so I got a Ph.D. instead of the vet degree, although Ph.D. is probably just as well.
Right. And I know your first love was astronomy. And so why don't you talk about that? And you did some work in the DIA through that, right?
Yeah, when I was trying to get into astronomy, I applied to jobs, and they just said no females, and I didn't have any success at all, and I wasn't allowed to apply. So I tried to get into mapping at first, into cartography, because they hired females, and they were also mapping the moon and other places. But I wound up with a real high security clearance, and eventually wound up at the DIA. And my one part of my job there was in air order of battle, and that was from using satellite photography and looking down and identifying airplanes at a particular location in the world. They had different people in different places, and so I was in photogrammetry identifying airplanes.
I see. Wow. That's so, and that's pretty interesting that you got involved with UFOs after having that background. That's pretty interesting. But and all the time that you were doing that type of work, I bet you were probably never really talked about UFOs, did you?
Definitely not. There were only 2 females on the whole floor, and it was weird enough to be a female, but I definitely didn't go around saying I see UFOs. Right. We had real high security clearances, and UFOs weren't supposed to exist even. So it's not something you talked about.
Right. Well, there have been some women in astronomy over the years that have really made some big breakthroughs. Let's see, Herschel was one of them. I'm just trying to remember who some other ones were, but there have been people but you're right. They start out with a disadvantage. Like, what does a woman know? That's the thinking then, which is kind of ridiculous. I do remember there was one that made some major breakthroughs in the 19th century at some point, which is really too bad why during our time and your time that it was looked down upon. That's really sad, because your life could have taken a whole different turn and you have been doing something you really loved.
Yeah, I was disappointed with that my whole life.
Right. So let's talk about, you've written a book before. That's what you talked about last time you were on. And you have a new book. Let's talk about that one.
My new book is Beyond Pascagoula. And Pascagoula, the Pascagoula abduction is very famous throughout. It's one of the most famous abductions ever. And what I wrote about was everything else besides the Pascagoula abduction. Should I go into what the Pascagoula abduction was?
Yeah, I mean, I've had Calvin on a few times, and actually I actually got him involved in when he was writing his book and connected him to Philip Mantle. And but Calvin had remained quiet for many, many years, and he actually I had a blog up on my website. He read the blog, emailed me. This is going back about 6 or 7 years ago. And when he did that, I was so excited that it was actually him. I said, "Is this the Calvin Parker?" He said, "Yes." And so he was on the show, and he decided to talk about it again. And and it's come quite a long way from there. It's always been a fascinating case, but yes, we do have a lot of new listeners. So why don't we go quickly into that about what him and Hickson experienced back then on the dock, right? The fishing dock. So go ahead if you wouldn't mind doing the nutshell of that.
Well, I think Philip Mantle said you were who connected Calvin and him.
Right. Yep.
So that's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, he's done a lot.
Yeah.
Philip has done a really good job with what he's done with this, and also you as well.
Well, what happened was, to cover it quickly, was that Calvin and Charles Hickson were co-workers at a shipbuilding facility, and after work they decided to go fishing. And so they went one place and didn't catch a fish and went someplace else and so on. Finally, they wound up at this place where Charles wanted to go, that was kind of posted like no fishing or something. And he said, it's okay to go. And Calvin was nervous about it and say the police will get us and everything. So they went on out to the pier fishing. And then they saw blue lights. And he was afraid the police were after him. And so he looked for cops, and he was going to tell Charles, it's your fault, you can go to jail. But it was much, much, much worse than the police, because this object came down. It didn't land, it just kind of hovered over the ground. And these three things came out, and two of them grabbed Charles, and one of them grabbed Calvin and took him inside the object, and apparently did some measurements on him and that sort of thing, and then released him. Well, they were terrified beyond anybody you could even imagine. And apparently Calvin, after they released him, was just standing there with his arms up in the air. And Charles kind of woke him up, and they discussed whether they should tell anybody, and they said no. And then Charles, who was the older man and who had been in the war and had been through real bad experiences, said, yeah, we have to tell somebody. And Calvin didn't want to. He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to get away and not think about it. But they first contacted the newspaper, and the newspaper was closed. And then they contacted Kessler Air Force Base. And they said, the Air Force doesn't take UFO reports, and told them to go to somebody local. So they contacted the police. And you can imagine what it'd be like to contact the police with that. I mean, Charles called and said, "You won't believe this, but we were abducted by a UFO." And, the police probably thought they were crazy, except that the person that talked to him could hear Calvin in the background crying and pleading not to say anything. And so they had him come to the police department, and they interviewed him separately. And then they put him in a room together, and somebody interviewed him, and the person that was interviewing left. And they didn't tell him, but they had a tape recorder hidden in the room. And so the police were planning to trap him, and they figured when they left the room that they would joke and say, "Ha ha, we really put one over on them." But instead, they were both just absolutely terrified and just beyond anything. And so then the police began believing him. And now, and due to the fact that there were two of them, and they had a lot of credibility on account of the tape and everything, it's one of the top, and they reported it immediately too. It's one of the top UFO abduction cases ever.
It really is. And there is the funny thing about that is the beings, the description, because Calvin doesn't remember what Charles Hickson did as far as I can pull this up in a minute. It'll take me a minute to find it and put it in there. But Calvin's drawing is from, not Calvin's, I'm sorry, Hickson's drawing of this thing has cones on its head. And that's not what Calvin remembers. And but he also remembers one that looked like a woman. He called it the woman. And, there was the way he was examined and all that is pretty bizarre. He had actually had some pain too. So, I know that really affected him in a lot of ways. So I'm trying to pull up the picture now, but so there were other people that actually saw this thing, not exactly at the same time, but people they think that some people are two witnesses, I believe. Is that right? That think they saw something that very same night? Is that how that goes?
There were more than one. A person from the sheriff's department said that actually there were 50 formal reports that night of people seeing things, and a lot of other ones that didn't get actually recorded. So there were a huge number of sightings of people reporting something that same night. And yes, they thought whatever the things were that got them were kind of mechanical.
Right.
The three that got a hold of them were kind of like mechanical things or robots.
And like floating off, not quite touching the ground, which is something that you do hear a bit about on some of the other cases too. For instance, the Ariel school, they didn't actually see this thing standing on the ground, this being, or there were 3 or 4 beings, whatever they were, like they floated along. That's what Calvin remembers. Now, I never got to speak with Hickson. He passed away quite a while ago. But according to Calvin, these robotic things came out, and as soon as they touched him, he feels as though they floated. It's a wild story, but it's the best part of this whole entire story, in my opinion, is the tape you mentioned when they didn't know they were being recorded. They had no clue they were being recorded in that police station. And, Calvin was horrified, and it came across. And that tape is available. I was actually able to listen to part of it. It's not very clear. You can hear it, but I do believe, I may have this right, that it's on YouTube. I don't know if you've ever listened to it.
Yeah, I've listened to it. I can't remember where I listened to it.
Yeah.
I could probably look it up, but I couldn't right now.
So what was the genesis of you writing this book? Let's get into that.
Well, the genesis was for two things. One is that Philip Mantle, there were actually a lot of other witnesses and nobody had come forth much. But he was finding people that will talk about it now. And so he wanted somebody in the United States to interview people and record the interviews and that sort of thing. And he was, over in, had an English accent and everything. I think he wanted an American to do it. So I was interviewing the other witnesses, but I had actually started on the investigation of that years ago, because something at the same time as their abduction, something had happened in my family that had caused me to be curious and start.
Well, do you want to just take a little sidestep and talk about that?
Yeah.
What happened in your family?
Yeah. What had happened was that I was at the University of Missouri at that time working on my Ph.D. and I got a phone call from my mother who was in Ohio. And she said, "Did you hear this sound?" And I started kidding her because she always said if she had dementia, we should tell her and things. And so I started joking with her and telling her, get the straight jacket and turn yourself in and everything. And she still seemed to be curious about whether I heard a sound. And I thought it was weird because she's a real skeptic. Several days later, she called and said that there was a real big UFO wave there and that everybody was seeing them, and a UFO had chased one of her friends in a car, and that people were keeping their kids in it and staying in at night and everything else. And so afterwards, I just forgot about it for many, many years. And then I was working at Ohio State University, and they had a newspaper room with actual newspapers. And so one day, just for a whim, I decided to go in and see if I could find a date on when that sound had happened. And I didn't expect to find anything. And I walked into the newspaper room. There were millions of newspapers, and I thought I'd never find this. But I thought it was 1973, and I thought it was in the middle of October, but that was just a guess. But I found it real fast, and it told about a real big noise. And I looked up more, and it was never explained. There was this huge noise. It was just heard over this huge area, and it had never been explained. And so just for something to do, I started doing some research on it. And I submitted it to a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and the State of Ohio seismologist contacted me, and he helped me do some more research, and I did publish it in the scientific journal. But what was interesting is that sound had happened just about as well as you could time it at exactly the same time as the Pascagoula abduction had happened. And so I don't know how it was tied together, but after a while, some people, I wasn't in ufology at that time, but some people in Ohio that were in ufology asked me to give a talk about it, and I called it the Big Bang and gave it. And that's what actually pulled me into UFOs, was into the organizations, was that. So it had something that happened at the same time as their abduction had happened, and that was sort of my start into getting into UFOs.
Oh, so it actually proceeded long before you actually were able to actually speak with Calvin Parker then.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't even paid attention to that, because what I'd paid attention to was the sound. Then I didn't pay too much attention to it until just a few years ago when Philip asked me to start interviewing people. And I hadn't even read too much about it then, but the two things happened at about the same time.
Yeah, and there was a flap back in 1973, right?
There was a huge flap. It was, a lot of people consider it the biggest flap they ever had. A lot of it was at Pascagoula, but a lot of it was in Ohio too, and all over the country. And maybe, I think it was the world. It was several references say it was the largest UFO flap that ever.
It seems to me that I remember about that time. I was actually in high school. I remember that there was a lot of things locally. Now, I grew up in southern Maine, right near the border of New Hampshire. And I remember that there was a lot of talk about UFOs early when I was in high school. So it's about that same time. And that was also the year of when they had the major gas shortage, the fuel shortage, if you remember that.
There was a whole lot going on then. There was the fuel shortage. There was the impeachment of Nixon. They got rid of Spiro Agnew and put in a new vice president.
Yeah, Agnew was a big criminal. Well, yeah. Nixon never got a chance to get impeached. He resigned. Yeah.
He knew what was coming up.
Yeah. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of. But I do remember at the same time, though, that was a very active time. And, I really wasn't paying that much attention to UFOs for most of my life, but I do remember people were talking about it. And there was also someone that tried to create a hoax. I do remember that in my area. Someone from high school got caught trying to put lights on motorcycles and something, I can't remember what it was, something bizarre in some sand pit or something like that. But but interesting. And so there was a lot going on in the Pascagoula area too. Is that what you found out when you were doing the research?
There was a whole lot going on, and people didn't report back then. One reason was because Charlie and Calvin were harassed so much that nobody even wanted to say anything. But now a number of people are coming forward, and there were a lot of reports back then and also in the papers. And so I've been interviewing a lot of people that are coming forth now.
Why do you think they would take all this time, and what kind of witness can you find this many years after? One of the things that people like to complain about is why do I always have guests that talk about old cases? And usually the reason I say it's important is because a lot of times people finally feel comfortable in coming forward and talking about it. Is that what you find has happened in this particular case?
Yeah, because they didn't want to talk about it back then because a number of people just told me how they were harassed and they were called drunks and crazy people and everything else. And so they didn't say anything. Well, now especially since the government and 60 Minutes and other things have said, yeah, something's going on. Well, they feel more secure about talking about it, and they don't get harassed as much. So quite a number of people have come forward.
So 1973 is a long time ago. Are these people very elderly at this point, or were there some people that were young at the time?
A lot of them were young, but if somebody just said, "What did you do on October the 11th, 1973?" Well, you wouldn't know. But a lot of them saw UFOs then, and then they heard about the Pascagoula abduction. Well, that made them remember that this was when they saw it. This was when this happened. And so they have something to lodge in their memory to hook it to. So I think that's why a lot of people, they saw something strange. And if nothing like that had happened, they wouldn't have said anything, but instead Charlie and Calvin came forth and said something, or Charlie did. I'm not too sure if Calvin wanted to, but and it made the newspapers and everything, and so people remembered that. And a lot of people wanted to report, but they were too chicken to, and finally they're coming out of the coop.
Yeah, well, so Calvin has been on several news stations in the area, talking freely about it now, and I'm sure that is making has made a change in the whole thing, as far as people like saying, "Oh yeah, I remember something."
Well, two of the people we talked to were the Blair, Mr. and Mrs. Blair, and how Philip Mantle heard about him was that Calvin gave a presentation, I think at the library or something, Pascagoula, and they heard about it on YouTube, and a daughter of the couple wrote a note to YouTube saying, yeah, my parents were there and saw it. And so Philip contacted him and asked me to interview him. And so anyway, I called up Mrs. Blair, and I first of all talked to Mr. Blair for a short time, and then her. And she said that, and her daughters confirmed that they had been on the opposite side of the Pascagoula from where Calvin and Charlie were on the day they were abducted, on the night, and that they were by a pier, and he was waiting for his supervisor because he and the supervisor were going out on a boat to do some work, but the supervisor was late, and so they were in their car and he was sleeping. And Maria said that she began to see this, what she thought was an airplane. It was flying around the Pascagoula River just randomly, and up and down and back and forth and everything. And she kept saying, the pilot doesn't know where he's going. The pilot seems to be lost. The pilot seems strange. And then her husband decided to take his clothes down to the ship. And it was about 9:00. And he walked down and she walked down. And she said as she was walking down the pier, this thing that looked like a person came up to the pier, and she thought it was a person. And she seemed to be very, very, very upset about it. And then they went on down to the ship. And then she said she came back about 12 to the car, and she was so scared she ran back. And so I could tell she was real upset about this thing that came out of the water. And so I interviewed her several more times, and she was just really stressed about it. And there was also seemed to be missing time too. But anyway.
Are you able to go more into details on this?
Yeah. Well, they were on the opposite side of the Pascagoula River at the same time as the abduction took place. And so the thing they were seeing might have been the same thing that abducted the two. And then her husband died last year, and her husband had been a debunker, and he had always told her not to talk about it, that, you know, people make fun of him, don't say a word about it, and that she didn't see anything. And finally, he got real sick, and before he died, he told Maria that they had been abducted, but that he didn't want to ever talk about it because of the harassment and everything. I mean, he was a man, he had a job, and he didn't want to, look crazy. And so he said he remembered being abducted, that they had taken him aboard and done measurements on him, and that he seemed to be kind of repressed about talking about it. I mean, he was for many, many years. But then, unfortunately, he died, and she couldn't get too much more information from him. But she said she remembered the thing coming down. She remembered the beings, or the one that she saw, but she didn't remember being in the object or anything. She just remembered that it was really brightly lit. And so she thinks she has repressed memories. And this happened way back right when they were first married, and they just started talking about it just last year. And then he unfortunately died, and she didn't find out any more from him. But he talked to her and to Philip both before he went on the ventilator. But after he went on the ventilator, he couldn't talk.
Oh. Wow, that's a shame. Did now this would be a prime case for someone like her to try. You know, I know it's not always, doesn't always work, but it might, to have a hypnotherapy regression, you know, and try to recall some more of those memories. I wonder if she'd ever be up for something like that.
Oh, yeah, I think she's interested, and I think she wants to be, but she's pretty upset after his death.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I don't think they've moved ahead on that because of that. I mean, she's still getting adjusted because she's been married to him ever since she was real young, and she's just adjusting to that now. Right.
And are these the two? I would consider that pretty major, but is there other people that actually witnessed something similar to that, or was it all just people that had seen things that around that time?
Well, this was first that I don't think it's ever been reported before, because they might have been abducted by the same object that had Charlie and Calvin. They don't know, but anyway, it seemed to be the reported abductions were the same time and place, which hasn't ever been reported before. But there was another, during that same flap, there was another instance. It was in Utah, not the same time. Just a few weeks later, of another instance of a object abducting several people at once that were different groups. And so that was a very first report of that sort of thing. And then there were other people. Calvin and Charlie had always been criticized because they were close to a big freeway, and they thought people should have seen that. But back then, nobody said anything. But another person was that there were crane operators and things like that, and people criticized, well, the crane operator and all these people should have seen it. Well, so I interviewed a crane operator who did see something at that time. And he was in one of these big cranes, and actually his crane, the picture of his crane is in the book that Calvin wrote. He was in a crane at that time, and he saw this blue thing, and he said it looked like it was kind of transparent, or like transparent plastic or something. And he saw it, and he wondered what on earth it was. And then his supervisor, the crane wasn't working, and he had to pull levers and things. And when he looked back the next time, it wasn't there. But this was, and then, the next day he heard about the abduction. And so that would have been the same night too. And there were several other people that had, usually when you get UFO reports, somebody says, oh, I saw something, a long ways away that just flew away. Well, with these, there were a number of real close UFO reports that were different from what you'd normally expect. Another person, let me see. There were some people on Dauphin Island, which was out somewhere from the Pascagoula River goes out, and then the islands sort of toward the end of it. And they were there, and they had a dune buggy, and I forget what they were doing, but anyway, they got the dune buggy stuck. And they were trying to get it out. Well, they said this big thing came over and stopped right above them, and it was shining this bright light down. It was so bright they could see all kinds of color in the sand. And they were absolutely terrified. And they were so terrified that instead of trying to push the dune buggy out, I guess they lifted it out some way and got it out of there real fast. And they told this man about it. And I guess he joked about him and said, yeah. And then the very next day, they heard about the Pascagoula abduction. And so after that, he believed him. And so that had happened that same night, too. And there were these 3 men that were going toward New Orleans, I think. I interviewed them, too. And one of them was kind of famous, but dead now. They were on the freeway, and they saw this object coming over them, and something flew down from it and was right in front of their windshield when they were driving. And it was like it was taking pictures of them or something. And the man said it was like they were all hypnotized, that they didn't say anything, and they just watched this thing, and then it flew away, and they didn't talk for a while. And then they turned around and went back, and it was about a month before they went to wherever they were going, and they seemed to be confused and not knowing what was going on. And it seemed like they were sort of paralyzed when the thing was there. So there were a number of other things. And then, they heard about the abduction the next day, so they remembered it. But there seemed to be a number of really strange reports for that same day and night.
Wow. And what did you say I believe you said something like a few weeks later, something happened in another state where there were several people abducted? Did you say that?
Yeah, there was one in Utah. And this was a woman that had a bunch of kids, 5 or 6 kids. And there was some kind of a disturbance, and she called the police about it, and there was about a prowler or something. And her kids had said there was a spaceman there, and she didn't pay attention to him. But about a year later, she read about UFOs, and she asked the kids again, and they said there had been a spaceman in the, I guess after that night, she heard there was a prowler, and she took her kids and went to a neighbor's, and then came back, and the kids had said that when they were there in their house, a couple of them said there was a spaceman there or something. And she didn't pay attention to it for another year. And then she heard about UFOs. And then, so UFO people began to investigate and hypnotized them. And they talked about that all the kids except one remembered being on board, and she remembered it under hypnosis too. And one thing they remembered that was strange was they remembered being lined up to get onto the UFO to be abducted, I guess, and they saw neighbors. And I think that was about the only other time when there was any reports of 2 different groups of people being abducted about the same time, and that was also during the flap of 73.
Wow. Back in 1969, the Berkshires abduction, there were people that it was all from the same area. They were talking about knowing, the other children that they saw on board, whatever this thing was. So that's the only other time I've ever heard of something like that. That's really fascinating. So all this happens. I remember when I was speaking with Calvin about how it kind of made his whole life a mess. He went into hiding for a couple of weeks. He had just started that job, and the phone was ringing off the hook. He was told to leave, and it was kind of a mess for him for a long time, and he never wanted to talk about it. And it was pretty obvious in the beginning he didn't want to talk about it, because he said that he wanted Charles to say that he passed out, just so he didn't have to talk about it, which, he was only 18 at the time. So, Yeah, it was. He's gone through quite a challenge with this thing.
Well, he really has. And so I've interviewed two people that were the wives of two people. I interviewed Calvin's wife, and I interviewed Maria Blair, and both had husbands that refused to talk about the thing for many, many, many years. And so, if you just interviewed one, it may be strange, but I interviewed two of them. And I guess my theory is that it's just so traumatic that it was like post-traumatic stress syndrome. They just didn't want to think about it. And there may be more that, that they don't even remember too.
Right. And how, I've talked about this on the show a bit. How well do you think I know this is such a traumatic event. You feel like you're going to remember the details, but things get changed. Your thoughts get changed. There's just no way around that. So when you're getting an interview with someone that had this experience back in 1973, and the first time Blair, I think you said it is, first time they're talking about it after all this time, how reliable is something like that?
I don't know, because like with Calvin and Charlie, everything they said was reported in the newspaper immediately. I mean, their tape and everything. Well, they've never changed it since then. They've said the same thing, many, many years later. But I think because seeing a UFO is pretty traumatic, that if people heard the next day about the abduction, that they probably remembered it. And they also told people, and I asked everybody if they told people, and most of them told a few people, like family members and things. And I have names, with some of them I can check, but with others I can't. But
right.
I think it sort of lodged in their memories because of the abduction.
Right.
Of hearing it right afterwards.
I think it's very important to document right afterwards as well. And, it's funny, when I was in San Rafael, California recently, I spoke to some friend at an antique shop, had nothing to do with UFOs. And all of a sudden I remembered that her husband had said something to me, oh, you do something on UFOs, and how interesting, or whatever. So they had a major sighting of a structured craft that was huge and just floating there and shot down beams. And she immediately, on her own, wrote everything out and drew a diagram. She sent me everything she wrote, and I'm trying to get her to talk about it on this show, at least briefly, for one of my breaks that I have. And speaking of breaks, we're going into the break here. It's time for us to go in, and but before, I just saw this question pop up. Dr. Scott, what did the alien Maria Blair saw look like? And if you can answer that quickly, we'll go into break after that.
Well, she thought it looked like a human, but it came out of the water. And I asked her if it was a fish, and she said no. And I guess it wasn't a dolphin. She thought it looked very human. But that's the only thing she remembered. But her husband saw beings or things or whatever. But I don't know exactly if she described them. And like, he went into a ventilator. But he saw a different group. One of them was like 6 feet tall, and then the other group that I think abducted him was like 5 feet tall or something.
It's really amazing when you think about, scientifically, all the changes that gravity can make on a being growing, evolving, and all that. All kinds of factors make up what a height is. Food, the availability of foods and things like that. So we're ready to go into the break. So if you're over at KGRA Radio, we'll be back in about 3.5 minutes. And for those of you at YouTube and Facebook and all that, we have Yvonne Smith coming up. Now, this little clip that I did here, she will freeze on the video, but the the audio keeps going. It was because we had bad internet where we were recording in Newport Beach out in California. And here it goes. So over at KGRA Radio, we'll be right back right after these messages. All right, I'm in Newport Beach with Yvonne Smith. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, nice to see you as always.
Thank you.
Can you explain what you're doing out here?
Well, I just finished 2 days of abduction therapist training that was one of my main goals. I was trying to do this for 4 years, and finally it happened this weekend. And I had therapists coming in from Massachusetts, from New Mexico, New York, and Minnesota. And my goal is to have a trained abduction therapist in all 50 states because it's very needed now.
Now, what is the criteria of the people that you will accept in your training?
They must already be certified in hypnotherapy, so they must be a certified hypnotherapist because I'm not teaching the mechanics of hypnosis. And these are therapists who have a practice, a functioning practice, and they want to just bring in abduction cases, but they're very interested in it. They know there's a need for it. So I'm just teaching them from what they're normally practicing, where you're using hypnotic regression and going through case studies. I did 4 live regressions with 4 actual abductees this weekend. So they could see what happens during an actual regression and what I do every day.
Right. Well, what in your opinion, what's the most important thing that you're teaching?
Well, the most important thing, first and foremost, is to help the individual relieve them from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Because when any one of us, we suffer a trauma, we will have PTSD symptoms. They're not able to function. It's interfering with their everyday life. We have to go to work. We have to pay bills. And we put them in regression to bring up the buried memories, whatever was buried in there, of their UFO sighting or their missing time. And as we bring it forward to a conscious level, then they're able to deal with, intellectually, okay, this happened to me, but I came back and I'm all right. And we teach them how to integrate it into their lives. That's why I created my support group, Close Encounter Resource Organization, where we meet every month. So I'm hoping that my new therapists will also start support groups around the country.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin, very much. You take
Always
care.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Stand by, Martin. In 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, welcome back. This is Martin Willis, and my guest tonight is Dr. Irena Scott, and always fascinating guest. I love the work she does in this field, and welcome back, Irena. And let me ask you this: Have you ever interacted with this topic with people that you had done previous work with in your field in any type of way? I mean, did you ever make friends in, say, when you worked for the DIA or any other organization in the past where you kind of came out of the closet on this, hey, look, I'm doing this book on UFOs or anything? Have you ever had that experience?
Yeah, and people made fun of me.
They do, really?
Yeah. So you see UFOs today and things like that. I didn't really go around talking about it, but people found out I was interested. They would, joke with me and things.
Well, they're just joke. They're not really, like, it's not like you wouldn't consider it ridicule, would you? I mean, it's more like joking around.
Yeah, I thought I was being ridiculed. My sister wouldn't talk about it much either. Even our family we talked about it, and they said, "Oh no, that can't happen." But she did. She was kind enough to fill out reports, and my mother was a real skeptic, but she filled out reports too. So I didn't have anybody, not tell the truth or anything, but there was some inhibition, which I had a lot of too, until I finally came out of the closet.
Well, I spent about 4 or 5 days in Seattle a few weeks ago, visiting my sister and her husband. Now, her husband, my brother-in-law, worked at Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico, and he's a chemist. And I believe he worked in the weapons. It was top secret exactly what he did. I remember when he was getting his clearance and all that. So the funny conversation is Selma Siddick. She is one of the people that is in the film will be coming out. We'll see it this year, I'm pretty sure, before the year's end, on a major streaming platform, The Ariel School Phenomenon by Randall Nickerson. That's coming out. Well, I've kept in touch with Selma Siddick, who lives in Seattle. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to visit with her. I didn't have enough time when I was up there because of the other things we're doing. But so I brought up to my sister and my brother-in-law this whole thing about the Ariel School and how, to me I think it's the most fascinating case of them all. My own personal opinion, if someone asked me, that's what I would say. And so I told them about all these school children seeing these beings, and some of them getting messages like telepathic messages, take care of the world and of the earth and all that, and some of them not. But their description of the beings was pretty scary, if you ask me. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. These are young children that are impressionable. So many of them saw it. Their accounts, their drawings, right after a teacher had the foresight to have them all draw pictures of what they saw. It's fascinating. But anyway, my sister's like sitting there. She was in the back. I was in the front. We were driving somewhere, and she's sitting there like a deer in the headlights, and like her eyes are glazing over. I said, "Are you actually listening to me? Are you listening to me about this?" And she got, yeah. And I said, "So tell me, do you just think it's all BS, and you think that I'm just doing this show and it's all just BS and means nothing?" I mean, she's never watched one of my shows or looked at any of it. And she goes, "No, I just don't know. I just don't know." And I said, "Well, that's a good answer." And then I looked to Mr. Scientist. His name is Wilbur, actually. And he gets the joke from Mr. Ed Talking Horse saying Wilbur and all that stuff. But anyway, so Wilbur takes everything. He's a real statistical guy, takes everything about statistics and very, very scientific or whatever. And so I said, "Hey, Wilbur, what do you think about this? What do you think about it all?" And he goes, "I think it's very possible." And I was shocked. And I said, "Hey, from someone that's totally a science guy, all you do is think science. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for being open-minded that it's possible." And I do see that, I'm going off my own tangent here. It has nothing to do with our topic tonight, but just made me think about it when you talked about people joking or making fun of you for taking this seriously. But I think that we are seeing a shift, that people of science are actually looking into this more than ever since the 10 years. And by the way, in just a couple of weeks, it'll be 10 years that I've done this show. And so I should have a 10th anniversary show or something coming up. It's actually another week and a half or so. I believe it was the 11th of November was the first time I did a show. But anyway, that was quite a rant I went on. What do you think about all that?
Well, they're always saying scientists don't see UFOs and all that. Well, I have scientific background. I mean, I have a Ph.D. from a perfectly good school of veterinary medicine, and I worked at in research at Cornell, which is Ivy League, and
Wow.
I was a professor and things like that. So and plus I have lots of research papers published. And so I think I have a background in science. And
I would say you do. Yeah.
I mean, they say, females aren't scientists, but I think I have the same qualifications as a male. But I think that scientists are coming out of the woodwork too. And some of the very best research has been done by scientists. Like, for example, I worked at Battelle, and I knew people that worked there, but Battelle did a study for Project Blue Book. It was Special Report number 14, and it was just an excellent study done in the best scientific way. And Dr. Harley Rutledge, who was a head of physics department in the University of Southern Missouri, I think, just did an excellent study, a field study of UFOs. And I think some of the very best studies have been done for scientists. And I was sort of emphasizing that in my previous book to say that, yeah, scientists do see UFOs, and some of them have done very good work on UFOs too.
That's right. And I do believe we're getting a little bit of feedback from your speakers. So if you could turn down your audio, I have your microphone on mute right now while I'm talking. It only happens when I'm talking. But yeah, if you could just turn that down just a little bit, that would be good. So yeah, I mean, I'm seeing there's a lot of scientists that are actually feeling comfortable enough, and it's about time. That's how I feel about that whole thing. Now, did I hear you? Where did you work at one time? I'm not sure what that noise is. Another strange noise across here.
That's from here.
Outside, yeah. I listened for a few minutes to Luis, the Unidentified Celebrity Review podcast with you, and you worked or had something to do with the place with the WOW signal, the SETI. Did you talk about that on his show?
Yeah, I used to work at the as an astronomer, but a volunteer astronomer at the Ohio State University radio telescope, and it was where they had the WOW signal. I didn't have anything to do with that, but I worked at the same place and knew all the people, and it still hasn't been explained. It's one that they consider might be a signal from ET, and it's about the only one they've ever found through SETI.
Yeah, and do you find after all these years and all the 24 hours a day pointed out there somewhere, do you think there's a couple? My thoughts is maybe that's maybe radio signals is very primitive to whatever beings are out there. That's also a possibility, and by the time they reach here, a civilization could be extinct, all that type of thing. But do you think it's also kind of bizarre that all these years have gone by and there's only been that one strange signal?
Yeah, and I interviewed the person that was in charge of the telescope on tape, and I think I put it on YouTube, and asked him, and he said that maybe, we're pretty primitive, and maybe, a few steps up, they are communicating, but that we don't quite get it yet. And I think the physics experiments, such as in quantum mechanics, things like that, to me, they're weirder than UFOs. And maybe we're sort of plowing along through, 1500s clockwork Newtonian physics. And quantum mechanics is a whole lot different. And so we may just be pretty primitive.
Yeah, I know. I've said this a number of times on the show that, wherever we are in existence in society, we think we're at the top of our game, and that there's, and that we know everything. That, we never say that we know everything, but we think we know mostly about physics or whatever, but I believe that we may have only scratched the surface of, because there are so many things, and especially at the quantum level, that we have no idea.
Yeah, I think quantum level is quantum mechanics is very, very different from anything we understand now, and the experiments in a lot of ways just point out that we don't know anything.
Right, and CERN, the collider there. I mean, they're coming up with just amazing things. And how small can small be? It's is it infinite? I mean, it seems like it could almost be, in a way. But it's all fascinating. All that stuff is fascinating. But anyway, so I'll just ask you a couple of questions. If you could give a theory, even with your science background and all that, where do you think these things could be coming from? I mean, do you think it's possible that they're extraterrestrial, or could it be they're multidimensional, or time travelers, or what are your thoughts overall on the possibilities?
I don't think they've given us too much information. Like, in thinking about that very first thing that happened to my sister and I back when we were tiny kids, we still remember it, even though we didn't talk about it for years because we didn't even know it had anything to do with UFOs for a long time. But it was like there was some kind of thought control. I mean, like, I remember I woke up and I saw this thing flying around. Well, I didn't know my sister was awake seeing the same thing. But for some reason, we woke up at the same time. And the room had two doors that were both closed and a window that had a screen. And so we don't know how the thing got in there. We don't know why we woke up at the same time. And then we watched it, but suddenly we both became terrified at the same time. Well, it was like there was some kind of thought control going through it. And also the thing just looked like a tiny piece of metal, but it behaved like something alive. And there was also, a suggestion of some kind of mind control. And so it just seemed like that, just way, way back, that if my brain would be working when I was a kid, that it seemed like that something that seemed just looked like a piece of metal seemed alive in some ways. And it also seemed like that we were experiencing some kind of mind control. And that's something that's made me wonder ever since if there's mind control involved in the whole thing, which also makes it very, very complicated besides the quantum mechanic aspect. And maybe the phenomena is giving us clues, but I don't think we're really picking it up. They say, well, this couldn't be done by us, therefore it's extraterrestrial. Well, maybe we're not very sensitive, and maybe there's a lot more in Earth that we don't understand either. So I don't know if we really know anything about it, except that, in my opinion, it might involve mind control.
That's really interesting. And I've said a number of times lately, it seems, that I do believe that we know very little about what is going on around us. Now, I remember you said it didn't make any sound. And I know that you and your sister were terrified and ran down the stairs, actually fell down the stairs when you were going down. But one of the things I don't think you mentioned, did you ever see this thing actually leave?
We didn't. I don't know how it came in, and it just seemed to disappear. We both became terrified and ran out of the room. So I suppose it just disappeared. I don't know.
And did you go back to that room that night?
Yes, my father said he would beat us up if we didn't go back in the room. Our parents didn't believe us. And so we both refused to budge, even though he threatened us. And finally, my mother told him to go up and look. And he went up and looked and said, there's nothing in there. And we very, very reluctantly went back in the room, but we weren't thrilled about it. But he turned on the light, and there wasn't anything there, but it was still pretty scary.
And I'm sure there were days that went by where you kept like looking for this thing and probably didn't get a lot of sleep, I would imagine.
Yeah, and another thing that was kind of funny is that my mother was a skeptic, and she told us that, that didn't happen and everything. But many years later, the whole family remembered it, believe it or not. And many years later, when I reported UFOs, I asked her to write it up. And like I said, she just had heard from us, but what she wrote up was that she said something had come in through the window and that we were terrified, and it flew. Then something came in through the window. Then this little thing flew around the room. And then when it stopped, that when it was flying around the room, we were terrified. And then we ran out when it stopped. It was like something released our minds. And that wasn't what either of us remembered, but it was so funny because she had an explanation for how the thing got in the room, and we had no idea how it got in the room. Neither of us saw it get in the room. So it was a little bit funny, the whole thing.
And can you give me your idea of what you consider mind control would be?
Well, in that case, there were two of us. And like if there was just one, if I was there by myself, they would say, this didn't happen, you dreamed it. But in that case, my sister and I weren't communicating with each other at all, but we both observed the same thing. And so it was like there could have been some form of mind control because we both saw the same thing. It was sort of impossible what we saw in a way. In the same way, I told you about that man that later, when my sister and I grew up, there's Jenny Randles wrote a book that said that kids sometimes see small UFOs in their bedroom, and then they grow up later and see large UFOs. Well, that was written many, many years after that happened to us, but that was kind of what happened to us, except that there were two of us, and then all the other instances I know of, there was just one person at a time. So we both have, independent, another observer. But what I just found out very recently about the weird man, when we had that sighting, is that I told you that he said he didn't see it. And then he gave me like the crazy sign. Well, my sister just a couple of months ago found a letter that she wrote to my mother that happened, that she wrote to my mother that day, the next day after we got home. And I asked her what she thought of that man. And she said she didn't see him. She saw him chase us. But when he was talking to me, she said she didn't know he was there. And she wondered why I took so long to get my camera ready and take a picture. And that was pretty scary because he was standing there pointing at his head and saying, I don't see this. And she apparently didn't know he was there.
Now, you were sitting inside the car though, right?
No, we were, when we saw the thing, we both got out of the car.
Oh, I got it.
And okay. I had a camera with high-speed film, and I grabbed the film and started loading the camera. And that's when the man came. And I was just ready to take this wonderful picture. And so he started talking to me. But we were both standing behind the car, and he was standing beside me. But she apparently didn't know he was there. And so that's pretty scary, too, and makes you wonder, especially since he was pointing to his head. And I thought she knew he was there, but apparently she didn't.
Wow.
So, and in that case, you talk about memory. Well, like I was working for the DIA then. I had a very high security clearance, and I was in aircraft identification. So I was sort of qualified for having a UFO sighting in a way. But I knew I couldn't report it then. But that night, I wrote down everything. And I don't have to rely on my memory because I just wrote down in detail every little detail that happened because I intended to report it sometime.
Well, there's a guy that I met I think he's a filmographer and actually doing something for Warner Brothers. I met him out and had a nice conversation with him. Nice guy. He's a friend of a friend, Dean Alioto's friend. Name is Charlie, and I was sitting there in Newport Beach, had a long conversation with him. But he said something kind of disturbing. I actually want him on the show because I like to have people on the show that have different opinions. He doesn't. Here he is. He thinks there's something definitely to the abduction. What is happening in abductions, but he doesn't think there's anything solid out there for UFOs. And one of the things he said, that no person out there is a better observer than another. I said, well, what about an astronaut? He said, no. I said, what about in military? He said, no. And he went on and about that. So I'm asking you, do you think you are a better qualified observer than most?
I think probably that it'd just be my guess that UFO sightings are evenly distributed around into people, but that scientists are more inhibited from talking about it than other people, or a lot of people in authority and things, because they would get in more trouble if they talked about it. And so I think probably scientists see as many UFOs as anybody else. But and I think, like when this happened to me, I wrote everything down to make sure I had it so that I could report it later. But I think, it depends on your eyesight and your memory and everything else.
But I think I've said this on the show before, I think it's very important. I was kind of surprised that my friend did this immediately, wrote something down about it, like you just said. I think that's very important, fresh in your memory and doing it right then.
Yeah, because I don't have to worry about whether I'm right now, because I wrote it down right then. And, if I had errors back then, I had them, but I wrote it down that next night.
And if we could, can you go over, I know we're not talking exactly like we were before we went into break here, but could you please go over the details of that particular sighting and what you saw?
Yeah. My sister and I were in our 20s then, and we had never talked about UFOs because our parents were, and everybody else, you weren't supposed to talk about things like that. But we were both on the eastern seacoast. I was working for the DIA, and she was in Drew University in New Jersey taking graduate courses or more advanced courses. And we decided to go up and see the New England states just for a trip, vacation, and went up. And we were going to stay in Boston, and I got to Boston. It was still daylight. So I went up to New Hampshire and drove around there a while. And interesting enough, I think we were in sort of the same place as some of the that abduction in New Hampshire took place. But anyway.
Betty and Barney Hill.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. I'm sorry. And then we came back, and it was dark. And we were going to stay in Boston, and I looked around, and I couldn't find a place to stay. Everything was crowded, so I was going to drive out to the Outer Belt and look around. And I was driving out, and I think it was on Route 9. And to the south of us, we could see an airport. I think it was Norwood Memorial Airport. And we could see airplanes coming in and landing and things. And they would come in with their red and green wing lights and their landing lights and everything. We were watching them. And there was this thing that was a whole lot lower. It was real white and blinking. And my sister started saying she thought this was a UFO. And I started saying, oh, you're crazy. And I kept telling her it was a helicopter. And we were arguing about it. And both of us at that time admitted to each other that we'd seen UFOs, which is something we didn't talk about. But anyway, then I kept on driving, and we were kind of arguing about it. And I got on the Outer Belt and came on down. to Route 95. And there was a woods to the west of us. And I saw this ball. It was like glass, and it had a light inside of it that was going through a spectrum of all shades of green, of all shades of blue, and all shades of red, and all kinds of shades of red, and then blue, and then red. And I couldn't figure out what on earth this was. Then the inside of the car lit up in green, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. And I looked around, there was no green anyplace else, and the only place I could think it could come from was this ball of light, and it wasn't green. And I just couldn't figure it out. And then it was on the side of us, and it was close to the ground. It was some distance away, and it was in a woods. So the green light left the inside of the car just lit up for a while, and then it wasn't green anymore. And we kept on driving. And then my sister started yelling at me to pull over because she said this light we'd been watching, which was a different light, was going to go across the road. And so anyway, she started yelling at me. And so finally I pulled over, and I was going to point my hand out the window and say, "Dingbat, see, it's a helicopter." And I pointed my hand out, and I saw a meteor way off. And apparently in my sister's write-up, she said that at that time that the inside of the car lit up, and that she thought the big object had shown a light in our car, which I didn't see, but then I was on the by the window too. And so the thing came over the road, and I realized that she was right and I was wrong. We could see it real plain. It had 7 windows, and they blinked in a sequence, like the first 3 would blink twice, and then they'd all blink, and then the last 4 would blink once, and then go through the cycle again. They were big square windows. And we asked each other, is this a blimp with lighted sides? And no, because it didn't look anything like it had. We'd seen blimps with lighted sides, and this was soundless. It was going very slow. It had one red light on one end that was real small and non-blinking, and one green light on the other end. It made no sound at all. And we could see it real plain. So I started loading my camera, because I was in photography for the DIA, and I thought this would make an amazing shot, because not only does it look like we're seeing the inside of the thing, but if I could get like several shots in stereo, maybe I could sort of prove UFOs exist or something. I couldn't, but I thought I could get a wonderful picture. Well, that's when the truck driver came up, just when I was ready to get the picture, and started asking me, "What are you doing?" and interrupted. Well, he left, and I had missed a real good picture. And the thing went over the airport, and it started circling, and it blinked twice going north, and then from north to south, it'd go so fast you couldn't see it. And then I wanted to get the picture, but I was afraid of lens flares because I was on a freeway. And so I ran up a hill beside the car, and I got a picture. And it took me a long time to understand the picture later, but I wrote that up and published it in a scientific paper. And what I thought is that this object was shining a light that wasn't in the visible range, and I had evidence for that. But anyway, then like I said, the truck driver chased us, and then after I got rid of the truck driver, I drove on back up. The object started going northwest, and I was trying to follow it, and I went past that light in the woods again. The inside of the car lit up in green again, and finally I was just on this real old bad gravel road that was had all kinds of potholes, and the houses were miles apart and everything, and I couldn't catch up with the thing. And finally I just gave up and turned around and came back. And then the next night I went back to Washington, and I had a poltergeist experience that night. And so it was a very long UFO experience.
Okay, well, if you think I'm going to let you get away without telling your poltergeist story, you're wrong. I'm going to have to hear that too.
Well, I was in science and I never heard of poltergeist and I didn't know anything about it. But that night, I went to bed and it was dark, and I kept hearing something like a man with shoes on walking in the room, and he'd be someplace and walk a few steps and stop, and then he'd be someplace else. There was a little bit of light coming through the window from street lights, and I couldn't see anybody. And if he got close to the bed, I'd try to feel it, and I was terrified. But I went to sleep. Then the alarm went off, and I thought it was morning. I got up, and I was going to fix breakfast, and I realized it was dark. And I looked at the time, and it was 1:30. And so anyway, I had this alarm clock with a broken off knob, and I couldn't turn it to adjust it very well. If I did it by hand, I did it with just plus or minus 15 minutes or something. I usually use the pliers to do it. And so anyway, I tried to adjust it to the time I'd get up. And I was terrified. And I went back to sleep. And the alarm went off again. And each time I turned on the light, and it was like a 100-watt bulb, and it was 2:30 right on the dot. Well, the light, I went back to sleep. I think I put a chair against the door, which wouldn't have done any good if I was hearing somebody in the room anyway. And it went off at 2:30, 3:30, 4:30, I think 5:30. And I was very seriously worried because I didn't know what was going on. And I had this high security clearance. And if you're the slightest bit crazy, you're out of your job. And I thought, if I went crazy, well, I'd lose my job and I'd be out, with a cup on the road or something, begging. And so I was trying to figure out how to disguise insanity at work and how to not talk to anybody. So then for some reason, my toothbrush just flew across the room and hit the wall. Then I got up and went to work, and everything was normal the rest of my life. So I found out about poltergeists, and then I found out later that people that have UFO experiences sometimes have poltergeist experiences at the same time. So
pretty amazing. And that was one of the questions that I had. I had what I guess I would call a poltergeist experience. I've never really figured out. It was something that made things happen in a house that I was cleaning out, after picking things up for an auction, that things actually really did happen. I actually witnessed them. And, but I hadn't had a UFO experience until, many years after, 20 years after or something like that. But, that was one of the questions that just popped up in the chat, was if you thought there may be a connection there. I do want to let everyone know that you can call in and ask our guest a question. That phone number is up on the screen, 855-472-5483. And Bill Skywatcher is standing by to screen your call. So call in if you'd like and ask our guest a question. So obviously, that happened the same night. That is totally bizarre. But I want to talk to you. How did you handle this thing happening? You had this high position job, high security. And obviously you didn't talk about it at work, but did you talk about it to friends or family members besides your sister, or did you think about reporting it?
I thought about reporting it, and I looked up UFO. I didn't know anything about UFOs then. I looked up UFO in the phone directory and found a number to call for UFOs. It was NICAP, I found out later. And I went to a payphone and reported it, but I didn't give my name or anything because I was afraid of, it might get back to the DIA, so I didn't want any information. And it turned out that's probably smart because, like I think you said, maybe NICAP had something to do with the CIA. And so I reported it, but I didn't give my name, so it wouldn't have been an official report or anything. But another thing funny that happened is that I was pretty upset about it. And of course, I didn't say I see UFOs at work, but I just sometime around, a little bit later, I was in air order battle and we were identifying airplanes. And I just mentioned something about, I read something about UFOs in the net paper or something. And I thought everybody'd start harassing me immediately. And they didn't. My two supervisors said that they had reported a UFO on our classified film. And they had reported it to their supervisor. And they showed it to me and I saw. And they said their supervisor had told them that it was a spot on the film. And it obviously wasn't, because it was on two different photographs. So it wasn't a spot on the film. But they said that their supervisors gave them this real funny answer that it was a spot on the film and nothing. And they were both real surprised about that. And I was surprised that they were that open-minded.
Right. I mean, that's actually good to hear. We have a caller. We have Ken on hold from Massachusetts. Ken, you are live on the air. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and it's a fascinating show. And thank you, Dr. Scott, for this show tonight. And I think it's a fascinating case, the Pascagoula case. My question is, it's really weird how it's a very believable case. They had a secret recording and the police were interviewing them. It's just strange how those creatures that brought them, the robotic-like creatures, never show up again in any other encounters. And that always blows my mind because it's a very credible case and then it's never seen again. What's your opinion on that?
They're not saying something that agrees with the media, because if they did, they'd probably describe what everybody else describes. So it makes me think more than ever that they're sincere, because they have the nerve to describe something different. And, I sort of wonder about mind control. All these people see all kinds of different things and they say, well, these are different species and things. But it may be that whatever it is that they put these pictures in their minds in people's minds of what they might look like.
That's an interesting thought. Anything else, Ken?
Thank you very much. No, that was it. I just wanted, because that was really, it's such a very fascinating case and very believable. And it was just strange always, usually people say, oh, you see the gray aliens, the big eyes, and it repeats. And then this very, very credible case, and then the creatures never appear again. So that's all I had, but great show. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That is a really good point. Also, for perhaps mind control. And by the way, the line is open, 855-472-5483. It's really fascinating. It makes me wonder about your mind control thing, because in this particular case, we have two people describing two completely different beings. Calvin didn't remember those cones on the head at all for the robotic ones. It did. I think he said something about them looking like they had one, almost like a single leg, or like their two legs were joined together, and not bipedal, but also didn't move their legs. They just kind of hovered. But it makes you wonder why so many times you do hear that people, even though they're having the same experience, they remember things completely differently.
Well, I think if somebody remembered exactly the same thing, I think it'd be suspicious, because I think, you remember things a little bit different. I mean, like if you saw a car accident, the next day you might remember exactly what happened. The next month you might remember a car accident, and a year later you'd remember something about it. But you'd remember less details, but you still might remember a car accident. You might remember the colors and things like that years later. So I think there's value in writing down whatever happened real fast. And in that case, they did. They were investigated instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really good. But
I don't think Calvin drew a picture of what he saw. Not right away. I know Hickson did, but not Calvin. I don't believe so. I mean, I can ask him that question the next time I speak with him, but I'm not sure about that.
well, I think like he didn't want to say anything about it for many, many, many years, and like lots of people want him to be famous. Like he could be world famous right then, and he just climbed up for the next 40 or 50 years until he finally. I interviewed his wife, and she said he didn't talk about it until he started writing the book. And that's because she was after him, and Philip Mantle was, and he trusted both of them, but that he didn't want to say anything about it for a long time.
Right. I was thrilled when he said he would actually talk about it for the first time on this show. So that was pretty exciting, and I was really thrilled that I say it again. I said it earlier that I think Philip Mantle has done a wonderful job taking really good care of him.
And so have you. And between both of you, you brought it out of him and his wife.
Yeah,
So
she's a
good.
sweetheart. Yeah. So one of the things I thought about asking you about, the line's still open if anyone would like to call again. We could take several calls, but if you'd like to call, we will keep the lines open right up until about 5 minutes before the end of the show. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, when the topic came up earlier today when we were talking about possible missing time, and what do you think of that phenomenon? Do you think, so many people have seemed to reported that they have missing time, and do you think that is more like a PTSD type of thing, or what do you think that might be about?
Well, like Calvin apparently didn't want to talk about it for one reason, because he was afraid the beings would come back and get him. But it seems more like that people might have been sort of put into a trance or something and told not to remember it, but then eventually they do. But I wouldn't know why.
Yeah.
The whole thing just seems funny. And in a lot of cases, time seems really funny too.
Yes.
There'll sometimes, like, people say it's like everything stopped and everything just stopped, and then they had this abduction experience, and then they were back where they were, just like a movie, and the whole thing could stop, and they're removed and are abducted, and then they're put back into the same movie or something. And there's missing time, like they've forgot something, and hours that they don't remember. But in other cases, they'll report that everything stopped. They were watching people and all the cars and everything stopped, and then came back to reality. And that's another part of missing time, which is mysterious.
It is. It is really very interesting, and that the thing about the whole time thing, could possibly have something to do with how they get here and go away too. These are all possibilities. I have no idea. We have a couple of people lined up on the phone. We have Dave calling right now from Pennsylvania. Dave, you're live on the air now. Thank you.
Hiya. Great show. I've been fascinated with the Pascagoula case for a long time, ever since I first read about it back in the 70s. And with renewed interest after the New York Times article, it seems to have given a boost to looking into the phenomenon. And my question is, has academia in general in mass, taken a good look at this phenomenon and tried to get to the bottom of it. Maybe they have, and I'm just not aware. So that's my question. What has academia done in studying this phenomenon, if anything? And I'm going to hang up so I can listen to the response. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Dave. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think they've done much, and I think that maybe they'll start now because it's a little more open with 60 Minutes and the government saying something could be going on and all that, which makes it a little more official than it ever had been before. The government in 1947, when UFOs first started, there was Project Sign, and the government took it seriously and considered maybe this phenomena is extraterrestrial and something we don't understand above us. Then Project Sign turned into Project Grudge, where they
Grunge.
Grudge. I'm sorry.
Grunge, yes.
Where they debunked everything, and then it turned into Project Blue Book, which also debunked everything, and then Project Blue Book quit. Well, now we're back to like we were in 1947 when they first began taking objective look at it. And we've gone through this big cycle of debunking and debunking. And it seems like maybe we're way back to where we were in the beginning, except in the beginning, I think they were doing a more serious study than they are now. But some people are doing a serious study.
Yes. We have Rick on from Texas. Rick, you were live on the air.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask her about the Dr. Alan J. Hynek. What information did he have from this? And also, is there any notes that left to his son about the Pascagoula incident?
We're still looking into that. Philip just gave me some information from NICAP that I'm reading now that included letters to Dr. Hynek. I published in my my recent book before this some of Dr. Hynek's letters that were written in longhand that that somebody gave to me, but she said she didn't know anything about. She was a good friend of his, but she didn't know anything about what he knew about Pascagoula. So I'm just reading now some of the. It wasn't about Pascagoula though; it was mainly about the flap of 1973. But he talked to the two men right afterwards. He was right there on the spot soon afterwards and discussed it with them. And he believed them and said they were, honorable people who were honest. And he believed them. He didn't know what UFOs are, and nobody else does either.
Yeah. A great story. I was talking with Paul Hynek and Calvin together. This was out in Phoenix a few years ago. And Paul remembered as a little kid coming in from playing, I think it was soccer or something like that, outside, the phone ringing. It rang all the time. He came in and Calvin was on the phone to talk to his dad, J. Allen Hynek. And Calvin remembers writing, they had a chalkboard in the kitchen where he wrote down his name and phone number. And then Calvin actually, they all met, the family. I think Calvin came there at one time or something like that, but he met him, a year or so later, I believe. I may have that wrong, but something along those lines. But it was interesting to hear Paul Hynek's take on that particular case.
Yeah, well, Dr. Hynek got down there just real fast and questioned him right after it happened.
Now, when Calvin went into more or less hiding, did he hide from those type of people as well, or was it basically just the press at that time?
Well, he was besieged by the press at work. He and Charlie went to work the next day, and the press was just all over him, so much that their employers said to go home, and he lost his job and had to get another job on account of, and the press was just following him, hounding him all through his life. And he wanted to live a normal life. He wanted to get married and have kids and things. He didn't want to be a weird UFO person.
That's
and
right.
so I think he kind of hid himself and used other names and things like that when he signed things. And what finally brought it to a head was that he and his wife went to a funeral, and they used the real name. And people came up and started, in a friendly way, asking him what happened.
Yes.
And then his wife said, "It's time to start talking about this." And that's when, he started coming out of it. But he just didn't want anything to do with it. And, maybe a lot more happened to him when he was on board or something he didn't know about. But it was very, very traumatic for him.
Rick, I'm so sorry. I had you on mute. You tried to say something?
Yes, I'm fascinated in Dr. Alan J. Hynek and him following up or any information that he did to further his investigation by, I understand that they both went to an Air Force base to be questioned and all that. Did Alan J. Hynek question the Air Force on their information from those two men? And also, are there hidden notes from Dr. Alan J. Hynek of more information from what they've been told?
I think Philip is trying to find it, and he's asked a number of people, and he hasn't, so far as I know, he hasn't received anything. And my last book was from Jenny Zeidman, who was a good friend of Hynek, and I asked her the same thing. Do you have more information from Hynek? And she didn't. And so Philip, I think, is still trying to find out.
Well, interesting. Hey, Ken, thank you very much for the call.
And this is Rick. I'm Rick. Okay?
Oh, I'm sorry. I got people's names mixed up. Sorry about that. Rick, thank you very much for the call.
Great program. I watch you and listen to you. Good luck for finding more information and exposing on what you're doing. Thank you.
Well, Philip is making a lot of effort to try to find out, and we're not getting it in place.
Yeah. So anyway, we are right at the end of our show now. I can't believe it kind of went by pretty fast. And your book, I do have it in the show notes. Anyone can see the link down there to it. And that should be a fascinating read. And do you think there's more? We have just a minute here. Is there more to come out about this, or do you think it's pretty much expended?
Well, a lot of my book was on the sound, and
we didn't talk much about that, or at all. Sorry about that. Maybe next time.
Okay. UFOs are sort of noted for not having many witnesses and things. Well, this sound was heard over a huge area by all kinds of witnesses, but it's never been explained. And I used a lot of information from NASA and things like that to try to explore it mathematically and everything. And it's a pretty mysterious sound, and it had a lot of witnesses, and it happened the same time as the Pascagoula thing. So it was pretty interesting and unexplained still.
All right. Well, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure as always.
Thank you.
All right. You take care. All right, everyone. So that's it for our show this evening. Thanks so much for being on board. And Chris Pittman next week should be a great show. And thanks so much. And remember, as always, keep your eyes to the sky.